Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of a little bit what I'm talking about is what is this organic kind of connection and movement and what moves the parakeet?
Yes, wonderful, wonderful. So let me do a quick introduction and I'll hand it over to you.
Great.
Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are diving into Dante's Divine Comedy. So the format for today is we're going to have short presentations by Doug, Rosella, and Phil, after which we're going to do lengthy breakout rooms where you get to talk about your takeaways, you know, what you're learning by reading Dante, and deliberately kept it to 30 minutes. They will be moderated to make sure that everybody gets to talk. If you have not read it, it's okay, you can listen, but then let people who have read it talk first. After the breakout rooms, we'll be coming back together to share our takeaways, raise any questions, and go from there. All right, so with that, first, I'm going to hand it over to Doug. Doug, welcome. Floor is yours.
Thank you. You know, it's funny, about 2 or 3 days ago, I began to think, I don't remember anything I've read. I don't know what to say. It's just too much stuff. And then I began doing some automatic writing in the morning when I get up, and suddenly all these ideas about Dante and the readings began to emerge, and key ideas for me. So I'm going to hit some of those things that emerged right at the point when I thought, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. And one of them is this idea of the guide and the phrase, "Let us go then," which is in one of the translations. And it's how, and then I realized it's how Eliot begins the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And then I did a just brief sort of looking up some things. And yes, of course, he enters it with a quote from the Divine Comedy, and he was very influenced by Dante. So the idea of "let us go then," it also happens with Scrooge and some of the ghosts in A Christmas Carol, you know, "touch my robe, let us go," and they move from one place to another. So this idea that, you know, you're lost in a wood began to remind me, or in a desert, or sometimes people talk about the wood, some people talk about that the place he was in is a desert, and it takes me back. I work in theater, and so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is movement related. And I've also done a lot of work in what's called dance theater, where it's a fusion of dance and theater. And I've worked with some of the people who work in that field, and have known a lot of, we had an improvisational dancer who used to teach our actors. So there are certain movement principles, and I found myself thinking about Bucky's movement principles. You know, one is orbital rotation, where you're going around a point. The other is axial rotation, where you're spinning. And so so that happens here a lot. And then there's expansion and contraction, and there's precession, which you know, which is a little too complicated, but it's a little bit like 90-degree angle effects. You think you're doing this and something else is happening, which I think happens with poetry all the time. There's an action. And so it goes back to Aristotle and the Poetics, that tragedy is the imitation of an action. So the action actually has been explicated by one of the writers on the Poetics, Francis Ferguson, who did the intro to one of the books of translations of the Poetics. For the Greeks, action was a movement of spirit, usually from inside to outside, but it also can come from outside to inside. So the lover is attracted from inside to the beloved, but the guide is also somebody who comes from outside and says, do this. And the Deus Ex Machina in the Greek plays, they're kind of messing everything up, and then suddenly a god comes down and lays down the law and tells them what to do. And that's sort of an example of something that comes at them. So this idea of what you're doing and what's happening to you, I think constantly recurs in this. And the interesting thing is that he often says that Virgil turns and I follow, which is also in Christmas Carol, oddly enough. The ghost turns from one scene to another scene. And then there's, sometimes it's instantaneous. They turn and there's a new scene. Sometimes there's a journey halfway around the world or all the way around the world that goes to present as an ability. But I began to think a lot about these archetypes of movement and the turning and following. And you're looking at this, but then you turn to look at something else, or the guide turns and takes you somewhere else. And this seems to be a really recurring choreographic movement in the piece that I find really fascinating. And then you get into the vortex and the spinning down, where he says each circle is more painful because it becomes tighter and tighter. The first circle is very wide, the next circle is smaller and more intense, and then the next circle is more intense. And then he talks about winds that are like hurricanes, which gets back to the biblical idea of we're going to inherit the wind. We're going to reap the whirlwind. So in a way, even the climate change we're doing now is really vortexes going out of control or happening much more than they should happen. There's a classic speech in Shakespeare, the war between Oberon and Titania, is really climate change they're talking about. There's this disastrous climate change that's happening that's personified in the warring of Oberon and Titania. Also realized when I was in Ireland, Newgrange, which is an old Neolithic ruin, is covered in spirals. And you go to a lot of the desert art in the Southwest and you see the spiral form. And then that took me to, I was traveling on the East Coast. Until I was an adult, I haven't spent much time on the East Coast. And occasionally I go there for 2 or 3 months to work. But I used to go there for conferences and get on a bus in New York City and then travel to New Jersey or travel to New England or on the trains or the buses. And I found myself passing minds. And I realized that's sort of what Dante is talking about. It's mining technology, which I realized you dig a hole. And then when you can't climb out of the hole, you sort of, because you've dug yourself in too deep, then you dig to the side of the wall and eventually keep digging on the side of the wall till you get out of the top. And then as you keep digging deeper and deeper, those spirals, but you're digging into the wall. I kept thinking about this and I said, you're digging into the wall. And so then you're carrying that out of the mine. That's what you're mining. So you're actually going over the area that you're mining. You know, what you're riding on today to take out the ore is what becomes the ore in following weeks and months. So this idea, and then I thought about the screw, and the screw has leverage. So at the point, it's much more harder and sharper than on the outside, the force. So the torque, which is another Bucky principle, torque, the movement principle, that this kind of puts more and more torque on the sinners as they're deeper and deeper into hell. And then I had an odd connection that hell doesn't freeze over, it freezes under, which made me think of Bucky's idea that the wind doesn't blow, it sucks. You know, what we think is happening here is actually something in another direction. There's a system that's pulling air to it. It's not the wind blowing, as we see in the personifications of, the wind blowing. In the Aesop's fable is a famous one, where the wind is blowing, but it doesn't blow, it sucks. And so a lot of these forces and the physics of it, I kept sort of thinking about. There's also something, so I'm going to throw out a couple of concepts in terms of movement. I think is one thing to track the movement of the piece. Like what was really compelling to me this time reading it is when they get to the river in Chiron is shipping people across, people get into the boats and immediately there are floods of people that take their place. So there are huge crowds, like in the battles in Homer, they come in, they move out, more crowds move in. So the movement, and then at one point, I think he even talks about leaves falling off of trees, that people dying are like leaves falling, which connects to Leaves of Grass with Walt Whitman and these sort of massive movements of nature. He's really sort of observing that very carefully throughout it. There are a couple of timely things that I think are interesting to think about. That we're approaching Easter and that this whole part of the book goes from Good Friday to Easter morning. I think it's an interesting thing to meditate on, that this whole journey through hell happens over a 3-day holy weekend. I'm not sure where to go with that. It's just something to ponder over the next few weeks. A more powerful public event right now, because I think the idea of what is he doing with this, and what is he doing with the pagans, and what is he doing with the Christians, and that he places all of the greatest pagan thinkers and actors and military people and leaders in limbo. And it made me think that this is, the interesting thing is that Dante is not sympathetic to the power of the Pope because he thinks it's so misused for financial and economic gain. That seems to be a real through line, is the misuse of money by power. And so that's one of the actions in the piece that he seems to be critiquing, you know, so that one of the actions is people who get power because they're good people, but then the power makes them corrupt and they start selling their power to the highest bidder, which I think is one of the worst kind of betrayals for Dante and is something we're living with very currently now. Now, the idea of the Christians and the Islamic and the Jewish traditions, I think it's a very interesting this week that the Pope went to meet a man named the Ayatollah, the Grand Ayatollah Sistani, who lives in a very holy part of Iraq. And this is a man we don't hear about much in the United States, but he's very powerful in Iraq. He makes very few public statements, but when he does, the country goes through a sea change, you know, and they're not power statements. He's not backed up by a military. He's a man who actually believes in the separation of church and state, you know, and when we invaded Iraq, we didn't hear much about that. Oh, are they ready for democracy? Well, here's the most influential man in Iraq who believes that the church and the state should be separate, which I think Dante is also concerned about when people gang up power and then use it in a violent way. And he's been a voice of moderation for decades in Iraq. And Iraq has a kind of split between Sunnis and Shiites. They've been the no man's land for centuries, where they fought it for a long time and then they just kind of gave up. And they said, no side is going to win this. So they almost sort of had a kind of melancholy surrender to let's just get along. Now, our invasion of Iraq broke that down. It led to civil war. Sistani could have united the country because at that time he actually had a lot of respect from Sunnis as well in Iraq. I don't know what it is now, but he generally has been a voice for peace, a voice for democracy. And he thought, okay, you got rid of Saddam Hussein, that could be a good thing, but hold elections and get out in 6 months. And that's one of the reasons we didn't hear much about Sistani. So, I mean, this facing of two leaders, I encourage you to look into this sort of articles that are generally fairly superficial. And usually some of them refer to it as the meeting of minarets and bells, but it's really two men who understand. I mean, that Pope Francis came out of Argentina and was at that time a controversial figure in the wars in Argentina between, and some of his more progressive friends were murdered in those civil wars in Argentina and the civil wars in Iraq. The meeting of these two great leaders is very interesting when it comes to what this story is telling us. So that's a sort of a second thing. The other is, what is Dante doing? There's a great history among empires in the West, and it goes back to Egypt, really. I mean, there were kingdoms in Egypt and Thebes, and there's a reason there's a Thebes in Greece, because they're kind of trying to take the sort of eagle of empire from Egypt. And then Greece goes to war with Troy and they defeat them supposedly. But one of my questions as I read this in the journey of Aeneas to found Rome is, who won the Trojan War? You know, just because they left Troy and created Rome, which then dominated Greece and most of the known world at that time. And then there was an offshoot of another Trojan who went up and started Great Britain. And Shakespeare writes in Cymbeline, I think, about the eagle flying north. So the eagle of empire flies from Rome to London. And many of these great cities and capitals are on rivers. And so I find it interesting that there are rivers all through the Divine Comedy. because people gather where there's water. That's where you can live. You know, there's a river, there's an ocean. You can't drink the ocean, so you need a river for fresh water. But what each empire does is it devours the previous empire and takes it on. So this mix of trying to own pagan motifs, put them all in hell as a foundation for his more Christian-based empire, I think is one of the things they do. I mean, there are many religions who go in and build their Christian churches on top of old temple sites, which were built on older temple sites of an earlier culture. So when you grab all of when you grab the geography, you also grab the mythology and you make it your own. And so that's why even Dickens does this in Christmas Carol, because the ghost of present is a Mars figure whose scabbard is empty and the sword has been broken or lost. And he's a party god. He's no longer a war god. He's a man who teaches Scrooge to celebrate and to feast and to enjoy life and to take care of the people who are poorer, what Dickens calls fellow passengers to the grave. You know, that's what Dickens is, that when you think of those below you as fellow passengers to the grave. So this motif will jump centuries of people who are taken by spirits and go on a mystical journey. And Christmas Carol is a kind of 5-step mystical journey, which I might share at another time. It may be more apt when we've gotten further into it. But each 5 of the staves, which is a verse of a song, and he breaks up Christmas Carol into the staves of a Christmas Carol. And so it's a poetic structure, and he uses some biblical rhythms in that as well. But I began thinking about the journey, and when I read the Bible, because my favorite playwrights were radical playwrights. At that time, they were my favorite. I don't know if they are now. There was George Bernard Shaw, Bertolt Brecht, and Ibsen. And all 3 of them said the Bible was their main literary influence. So I had left the church I'd grown up in, but when I was in college, I began reading the Bible from beginning to end, and it took me about 10 years. And what I was struck by, other than the inventories of who begat who and how many people were in tribes, were one, sort of the economic progressivism that's in the Jewish and Christian scriptures that we lose touch with very much, which I think Dante is very aware of. The wise use of money as opposed to the corrupt use of money. But then also, as new religions form, they get corrupted. So they go on a journey to leave Egypt, and what's the first thing they do when they're on their own? They build a golden calf, you know, and then that has to be sort of destroyed. And then, you know, so that a better relationship, not making money and gold the center of your religion. But it's very interesting how almost every religion starts with a concern of the poor, often starts with empowering women, often starts with a series of very progressive things, and then gradually they become more and more what Karen Armstrong explores, that conservatism, that fundamentalism, which is going back to the fundamentals that never existed when the religion was started. That each new breakthrough religion tends to create something new that then ossifies and hardens. And so that also seems to be this: who's in power today, who's in power tomorrow? Does this pushing things to a civil war ever really work, or does it create so much damage? And that's a hard one. I mean, when you look at the range of civil wars. The one other idea that I'll put out, and I think that I'm about out of time, is I began thinking about Francis Yates and the art of memory. And that a journey is a kind of way to remember things. Okay, you go even the Stations of the Cross or Scrooge's journey through the 3 ghosts, or actually there are other ghosts in the first stave and spirits in the 5th stave that are implied. And, you know, he goes through this whole thing, but you can remember it because there are places you go to. And the art of memory is based on the idea that in the classical architecture, different parts in the building were designed to teach you a principle or teach you some element of a system of thought. And so as you walk on a journey, I think in Dante doing this journey, in a way, the journey is an art of memory where the more you read it, you begin to go, oh, that's there, and that's in that place. And then we hit here, and then we're dealing with this issue. And you may end up seeing it from a very different angle than Dante did, but he's taking you through a very specific journey. And this took me back to the Bible because there are all these journeys through the wilderness. And so you go from one city to another, and what's between cities? Not the highways that Eisenhower built in the USA, it's wilderness, where you're going to meet friends, or you're going to meet thieves and robbers. You're going to meet people who help you, or you're going to meet people who try to stall you and throw roadblocks and say, this is my land, you can't cross, you can't come through this gate. And then the one other idea, the Gates, began to think about Bucky and the systems thinkers, that you basically have, if we can define a system has an inside and an outside, and that which separates the inside from the outside. So you have all these walls and gates that you have to go through, and sometimes you need divine aid to blow that gate open, because the movement is meant to be more free than what the local xenophobic people want to have happen, you know. And that's a big step from Egypt's Thebes to Thebes in Greece. But then Oedipus leaves Thebes, which has become a very xenophobic culture, and he goes to Athens. And that's a whole nother story of why Oedipus is really a hero, and it's a very complicated thing, and I could get into that at some point. But this idea of what is a hero and what is the sacrifice of the hero to lead to a new knowledge, which I think is embedded in a lot of, so you see, why are these people in limbo? Why are these people in hell? I also think there's a certain grief and sadistic glee Dante has in throwing people into various circles of hell, but that's a different thing. But the idea that empires actually swallow and devour other empires to digest their knowledge, it goes back to the warriors who used to kill an opponent, and they didn't do it out of brutality. They often ate the body to assume their powers. So the cannibalism often was a ritual of gaining the wisdom and power of somebody you defeated. You might have had dinner with them the night before the battle. You might have had, you know, there's another kind of hospitality there. But the wilderness idea is that I mentioned this before, you treat the stranger well because they might be a god in disguise. You fear they're a thief, but you treat them well because it might actually be a god in disguise. And we've gotten a long way from that kind of classical wisdom of how do we treat, you know, the other. So those are kind of some of the things that hit me, but the vortex is the thing that kept coming back to me. The spin down, and then the journey straight out, and then the spin up the mountain, and then this expanding into paradise, which seems to be almost a more, you know, blowing your mind in a completely different way. So that's again the movement of Bucky, expansion, contraction. You know, he wilts, but then he's given a few, Virgil tells him, all these women love you, and he suddenly is excited. He suddenly feels great because he's loved. And I think we all know that, you know, when we're getting the sun and when we've lost the sun.
Wonderful.
So I'll end with that. I think that's expansion, contraction.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Doug. That was great. Next up is Rosella, followed by Philip. Rosella.
Sorry. Well, I'm quite don't know how to follow that. Mine is more simplistic and to the point. So since we have not started to read the cantos yet, or you have read them on your own, I'm going to start with Canto I. Okay, so the Divine Comedy is
Rosella, let me just give a quick introduction here.
Okay.
Rosella has been teaching Divine Comedy for a long time. She said, I have read it only 300 times. So that's where she's coming from.
The
Okay.
Inferno especially.
And
Yeah.
she said that it's going to, she said, how much time do I have to talk about this? And she said, I would need at least 2 hours per canto. I said, we don't have 2 hours per canto, but so that's the context. All right, Rosilla, you're on.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to talk fast. If I talk too fast, please let me know. So Dante started to write the Divine Comedy in 1306. And his work was originally titled Commedia. Commedia was in Italian, which commedia in the 13th, 14th century was something that began bad and ended well. So if you think about the Divine Comedy, you have Inferno, where there's no redemption, Purgatory, where you have the chance to, it's all about redemption and make it into heaven, and then the heavens are the glory of God. And so it is a story that ends in the that begins in the dark woods, lost, and it ends with the vision of God. Even though, because of blasphemy, he says he really doesn't remember when he saw God, what did he look like particularly, but he does remember what he felt inside his heart, which was all warm and good and all of that. So basically, when you start to read the Divine Comedy, the Inferno is the first canticle. So it's made up of 3 canticles. What's a canticle? It's a collection of cantos. Cantos are lyrics that are meant to be sang or chanted in the oral tradition. Because at the time Dante started to write the Divine Comedy, 93% of the population was illiterate, okay? He also writes it in Tosco-Florentine, which is a very, very big deal because the elite poets wrote in Latin at the time. The numerology of it's throughout the whole work. The number 3, the multiple of 3, so 9, those are the 2 perfect numbers. 3 is the Trinity, the 3 ladies in Canto 2. There's a variety of it. The 3 realms, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradiso, and the 3 heads of Lucifer, which, the number 9 is the perfect number. It's the multiple of 3, okay? And so he divides each canticle into 9 portions, and plus 1, and that makes it 10, which is also a perfect number. It's the 10 commandments, the 10 laws of the Decalogue, the 10 plagues of Egypt, blah, 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 blah. So the Inferno is divided between the dark woods, which is part of the first canto, right? 9 circles, and that makes 10, okay? Purgatory is divided into the 2 in English you call them, I don't know if you could say anti-ledge, but the sort of like a entrance in 2 levels, 7 terraces, which are the 7 deadly sin, and then terrestrial paradise. Okay, and that makes 10. And Paradiso is divided between 9 heavenly bodies, and the Imperium, which is where God resides, and that makes 10. Each canticle has 33 cantos, except for the Inferno, which has 34, because he presents the first canto as a reference for everybody to know why he's there, why he's writing this. When he's writing this, he's telling people that he's remembering all the bad, the hope and the good that he saw, okay? And that he is willed by the good that he saw to write about all the bad that he saw. So the year of the that he places the divine Istrip in is the year 1300. And there are a few reasons why he goes back 6 years. Well, one, the year 1300 was the year that he was prior. The year 1300, my dog wants to make a presence. The year 1300 was the year that he was 35 years old. And the year that Bonifacio VIII, who was Dante's arch nemesis, had instituted the first Jubilee. Do you know what a Jubilee is? A Jubilee is, you have to make if you're a Christian, you had to make a pilgrimage to Rome. You had to, attend a church event, a mass or something, at either St. Peter or at the time St. Paul outside the walls. You had to confess, receive communion, and most of the people that went, and they were given an indulgence that if they did that, they would be, all their sins would be erased. Now, Dante was very upset about that because he is of the point that that money does not erase sin. And that gave also birth to a lot of the churches that you find in Italy, because a lot of the churches you find in Italy, they were built besides the castle of the rich people. Think the Medici in Florence. The church of San Lorenzo in Florence was built so that they could receive from the Pope an exoneration from sins. So Dante was very upset about that, and he was very upset about the indulgences. And then by putting the Divine Comedy backward in 6 years, he's also able to foresee some events that have already happened, like the death of Bonifacio VIII, without being called a blasphemer, although he was already called that, when he sticks Bonifacio the VIII in hell while he's still alive in the year 1300. Do you understand what I'm saying? No? Okay. There's a few other novelties, so to speak, that Dante is the father of. One is, if you read the first tercet, midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward path had been lost. So the journey of our life, so he puts all of society, all of humanity into the, he's talking to all of humanity, okay? But then he starts the second line with I. None of the epics that were written up to that time, think about the Aeneid, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Ovid Metamorphoses, any of them, they were never written in the I, they were written in the third person. They were stories, they were told, okay? So, and then he says the straight path had been lost. Did he lose the straight path? Yes, but he's also saying that humanity has lost the straight path. And he says that it is so hard for him to remember, you know, what he saw. And the beauty of some of his lines is when he uses three adjectives, one after the other. What was this forest savage, rough and stern? It gives the reader really the idea, you know. But he says it's so bitter for me to remember, but in order to tell of all the good that he saw in paradise, he's going to have to tell about all the evil that he saw in the Inferno. And then again, he says, speak I of the other things I saw there. And then in Canto I is divided kind of into three parts. The three beasts, the encounter with Virgil, and the Virgil explaining to Dante why he needs to go another way and why he needs to gain courage. Okay, so the three beasts, before I say that, many people who read Dante, they feel that it's a very religious epic. And in reality, it really is not. He's very ingenious because throughout the Divine Comedy, he talks about three things. He said that in order to live a good life, you have to live the social life, the ethical life, and the political life. So you have three roles in society, and you can't live, let go of one and live the other two. Or you have to, you know, live all three in order to be able to one day gain the heavens. Okay, and to be a good citizen. All right, which we could bring, it could be brought to today's way. You know, in this time of COVID, we all been socially involved? Have we given to those who were less fortunate than us? Have we been politically involved? If anything, did you vote last November? Okay, it is a duty, according to Dante, to be immersed in the political life. And the ethical life, of course, is your religion. Yeah. So the encounter with the three beasts are very important because the three beasts, they represent the three levels of the Inferno. The Inferno, contrary to Purgatory and Paradiso, which follow a Christian framework of sin and of virtues, the Inferno adopts an Aristotelian framework of sin, where you have the least detrimental sin on the top, and they're represented by the leopard, the spotted leopard. The first group of sin comprise the sins of incontinence, which are passion that people in life cannot contain, like lust, gluttony, avarice, prodigality, wrath, sullen. They don't necessarily end up in murder, but they end up hurting other people. And if you die without being repented, then you will be in hell. Okay. The lion, which is the second of the beasts that stops his path, represents anger and represents violence. And the she-wolf, which is the third of the three beasts, represents cunning. Now, it will be talked about a lot throughout the Inferno. You know, Dante has many roles. He's the narrator, the pilgrim, the student, the judge, jury, and so on and so forth. Later on, we will know that the she-wolf, which cons, right, is the worst of the three beasts. And Dante will ask Virgil at some point, well, how is murder less than thievery, for example? Well, there's a lot to do with the human intellect. A lot of violent sins are not committed with, well, you know, oh, let me do this, I'm going to do this so that I can get that. They're not studied, they're not premeditated. Okay? And as violent as they could be, they're less closer to Lucifer, who is the cunning, you know, example of all humanity. You know, the Garden of Eve and the apple and all of that. And the sins of cunning that involve premeditation are many, and they will be dealt in circle 8 and then circle 9. Okay, and circle 9 will have murderers, but they would be murders that were premeditated, and they will introduce family, guests, countrymen, and then benefactor. Who was the biggest benefactor of all? Jesus. What did they do to him? They crucified him, knowing that he hadn't done anything wrong. Okay? So, Virgil was chosen by Dante, not by Joe. Oh, okay, I saw Virgil in the dark forest. Virgil is the writer of the Aeneid, which was considered the Roman national epic. And he wants to be remembered. Dante has a very big side of pride. Now you could say, well, it's good to be proud. Yes, but if you have too much pride, that leads into sin. And he wants to be remembered as the one who wrote the first Italian national epic, you know? And so he chooses Virgil as his teacher, and Virgil represents human reason. He's in limbo. Why? Because he was born before the birth of Christ, and Dante devises limbo for children who were not baptized. So they died with the stain of the original sin, and then all the virtuous pagan. That is a very leeway that he takes in, you know, in when he meets all the virtuous pagan. It's because he wants to give homage to the philosopher, the mathematician, the doctors, and all of that. And so Virgil is one of the virtuous pagan in limbo. Okay, and Virgil is from Italy. It's from Mantua, Italy. So of course he's gonna choose somebody from Italy to guide him. And I'm going to leave a lot of stuff behind, but at the end of Canto I, Virgil makes very clear that he has to go a different path, that he cannot go where the sun, where he sees the sun. That's purgatory. He can't go through to purgatory before he goes through the pits of hell. All right, and back to what Doug was saying when you were talking about the mind. It's funny because the Inferno is a funnel created by the fall of Lucifer from heaven, and he created this void into the earth. And then what does Dante devise? Dante devised that there was like a river underground, and all the earth that Lucifer pushed into the vortex of the earth came out of another opening, and it formed the mountain of Purgatory. The mountain of Purgatory is neither on earth or in heaven. It's suspended. Now you have to remember that Purgatory was a recent invention of the Catholic Church. It was about 200 years old, give or take, maybe even less. And the reason that it was invented, it was because of getting money for entrance into heaven. Okay. Any questions so far?
Let's do one thing. Once you wrap up, we'll do kind of the breakout.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that in Canto II, Virgil tells them about the three ladies. The three ladies in heaven who felt sorry for him. The first one to see Dante lost was the Virgin Mary. She's the mother of us all. Okay, so Dante is our son and he's lost. So she went to St. Lucy to ask her to go to find someone to go in our aid. Why St. Lucy? St. Lucy is the patron saint of sight, light, okay? And St. Lucy went to Beatrice, who was the love of Dante's life. And Beatrice goes to limbo, and she's not mentioned by name because she can be until he gets into terrestrial paradise, and convinces Virgil to go in Dante's aid. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you read it, but it's so beautiful when it says that he's for so many years, his voice is hoarse because he hasn't spoken in century. Okay, so when he first meets Dante, his voice is like, I haven't spoken, like that. And it's such beautiful poetry, it's unbelievable. So when Dante hears about Beatrice, not so much the Virgin Mary or St. Lucy, but Beatrice, oh yeah, okay, let's go, and then of course, he will be afraid. And now there's a couple of things that you have to keep in mind throughout the Inferno. Dante will walk behind Virgil to his side, and then slowly, together, but he will never walk in front of Virgil. Okay, that's very important. And going back to Doug again, there's many mention of the East and the West and the winds, the 7 winds that they knew at the time. The sun rises in the East and sets in the West. And so they walk from circularly from East to West and going down. So I think I'm pretty much done. I covered 2 cantos real fast.
Excellent. Really amazing.
Thank you.
Really amazing.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So now we're going to go for Phil, and after which we're going to do breakout rooms where we get to discuss it with other people who are reading Dante, and then we come back for our takeaways and questions at that point. Phil.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that intro, Rosella and Doug. It was great, very interesting. I also wanted to mention something, Doug, you might appreciate this. So when they go down, they're always turning to the left. And in Latin,
except one time in when they are in circle 6.
Okay.
Amongst the tomb of the heretics.
Okay, but in general, they're going leftward, and in Latin, that word is sinister, which we get our sinister from
character.
That. Yeah. Yep. So you might, anyway, since Doug, you were talking about that spiral motion downwards. It's very symbolic. Everything has meaning in this poem. There's nothing random. So when it says they're going to the left, that's meaningful. Every animal, which is why it's so interesting to read. And actually, that's what I wanted to briefly talk about is different ways of reading the Commedia, which of course is actually given to us by Dante himself in the letter that he wrote to Can Grande della Scala. Now, I know that some scholars debate about the whether or not it was actually written by Dante. I think most of them think it was. However, what I'm going to say actually is found both in that letter and in Convivio, which is the other great work of Dante's. And there, Dante talks about 4 meanings that you should be watching out for as you read a work of art. And the 4 meanings are, number 1, literal, which is the physical description of what you're reading. The second one is allegorical. The third one is moral, and the fourth one is the ultimate meaning, the end result. And he gives this example of how this works in the Bible, and then he compares his own writing to the Bible, which is also quite controversial because he almost puts himself on that same level of meaningfulness and interpretation. And of course, that's quite unheard of in some ways. So he uses the example of the Exodus. You're all familiar with that story with the children of Israel leaving or being rescued by God from Egypt. And so you have the literal meaning of that. The allegorical meaning, as Dante presents it, is this redemption by Christ. The ethical meaning is the sort of conversion from the worldliness of sin to the divine kingdom. And then the ultimate meaning is the actual transportation from this world of sin into heaven. And then he says, okay, well, how does this apply to the Commedia? Well, in the Commedia, the literal meaning is the state of souls after death. And that's what we're reading about. We're reading about hell and how souls are, how they fare in hell based or in purgatory or in Paradiso based on what they were doing in their earthly lives. And then what's the allegorical meaning? Well, the allegorical meaning, which is, I think, where it becomes really interesting for us, is the idea that people have different experience based on merit or demerit, based on what they do. So this really takes it out of the religious context and puts it into ethical, moral context that is probably most applicable and most interesting to us today, and whether or not we agree with Dante. And of course, the ultimate is his aim, his goal in writing this, which is to do what? To take people, as he writes in the letter, to take people out from the experience of sin and death into the experience of fullness of life. Now, so that's the four readings that he suggests. Now, of course, in the modern day, we have many additional readings that we might want to suggest, and those are, some of the, with the postmodern theory and deconstruction and some of the other ways we read or approach a text today. But those are at least 4 readings that you have to track as you read this. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention is the connection to La Vita Nuova. So we left it last time, but I think we should keep it in the back of our minds, because as you remember, when we left it, Dante promised us something. He promised he will never speak of Beatrice until he is able to speak of her perfectly. And this is supposed to be the fulfillment of that promise. So now, in some ways, it's not clear right away what's the connection between a love poem and a story about hell. It's all about love and nice things like that. And then now we're in punishments and sort of a little bit of sadistic scenes. But the interesting thing that I think about is this idea that Dante takes this idea and concept of love out of the just purely human experience, human interaction, and makes it a broader philosophical concept of how do we, as people, as human beings, how do we manage love and desire, proper love, the objects of love, And I think this idea, if we read it from this perspective, the idea of hell and hell's punishments is this idea of devoting our love to either a wrong object or possibly having sort of intensity of love relative to other things that is improper. Like, for instance, this idea of people that are sullen, which is kind of like unusual. We're reading about the avarice and all this, and all of a sudden we have the sullen. Like, what is that? What is the big deal about that? But that's interesting point of managing desire and maybe enthusiasm, right? And this lack of enthusiasm for the world that God created is in itself an improper management of this gift that we have, the gift of desiring. And by the way, I just want to mention one thing that I thought was very, very interesting and pointed. I don't know if many of you know this, the origin, the etymology of the word desire, it comes from Latin desidereo, which is desidereo, which is the root word there is side, which is star. So stars and desire are connected because we look up, we look outside of ourselves and we see the stars, and stars play a very prominent role in the Commedia. In the very first canto, in the Inferno, you have this mention out of the blue of divine love and stars. And in the very last verse of the last canto, the very last verse of the Paradiso, which is what we finish with, there's again the mention of divine love and stars. I mean, so it's got to be important. If you start with that and you finish with that, we've got to pay attention to this phenomenology of stars and astronomy in general. So that's another point. Very quickly, I just want to mention one thought about Virgil. So why is he chosen as a guide? So obviously, Rosella mentioned some of the prominence that he boasted as the author of Aeneid, and he was indeed the prime figure there in Roman literature. But more philosophically, it's interesting that Dante didn't pick Aristotle, a philosopher, or somebody like that. He picked a poet. And I think it was, I don't know if any of you listen to those lectures on YouTube, there's some mention of that a poet is uniquely positioned to bring together philosophy and art. And art is something that we experience not with our minds, but with our passions and heart. And so a moral system cannot work purely on a rational basis. It has to include both of those things. And I think that's really ingenious and speaks volumes of Dante's insight into human nature and how we function. We can't build a system of ethics that's just purely rational. It has to incorporate real life and real human experience. And of course, another interesting thing about Aeneid is it's a very political story, right? It's a story of the founding of a nation. And I think Doug also talked about that we have this idea of separation of church and state, but we also have an idea of empires and ideas of godly versus ungodly governments. And Dante, as a writer who really, his ambition is to write the second Aeneid, the Italian encyclopedic work like that. He covers all of that ground. He covers not just human to human interaction or human to God interaction, but he covers the society's interaction and on a larger scale. So that's just another reading that we have to keep in mind. One other thing, and this kind of piggybacks on the email that you guys are on the email list with CJ. So he was talking about the punishments, and so I'm not going to give it away. There is a certain logic in the punishments, and I think we're going to get there at the end of Inferno. But I just want to mention it now so that maybe you can start thinking about if you haven't already, like if you don't know the answer already, which is there's a connection between the sin and the punishment.
Oh yeah,
it's not random. Yes, contrapasso.
The law of the contrapasso. It's either a
yes, well,
yeah.
Yeah, I didn't want to give it away, but okay. So anyway, so keep watching out for that. There's really a deep meaning, which is that ultimately everyone gets what they want. We just don't get it in the ultimate full expression of that. And hell is a place where you get, at least in Dante's sort of interpretation of this, where you get the ultimate result of what you actually are looking for. So in other words, you were looking for passion. Okay, so now you're eternally swayed back and forth like Paolo and Francesca in the sea of passion, forever. That's what you wanted. That's what you're going to get. So that's, and then one last thing, and I'm going to finish with that, which is the literary aspects of reading Dante, the beautiful similes. And I already mentioned a couple of similes last time, but as you read it, just some amazing similes that Dante uses. And of course, similes, when you compare something to a natural phenomenon or something else, you have the beautiful simile at the end of Canto II, or rather Canto III, where the people are compared to leaves that are blown off in the fall from the tree. I mean, it's just what a wonderful picture of that. Yes, beautiful picture there. Then I also want to mention Anaphora, which is when you start the verses with the same word, like per me, through me, in Canto 3, where, the gates of hell. And then, of course, amor in Canto 5, where Francesca explains how she and Paolo fell for each other. So those are just some things that to be on the lookout. The beauty of the language itself, I think, is very important. And that's it. That's all I have.
Can I just add to the the similes are very beautiful, and there's one in Canto 1 about the ferryman that is shipwrecked, and he gets to the shore and he looks behind, but there's also a lot of metaphor throughout the work, and it's incredible because when he talks about all these things, there is an incredible knowledge of botany, astronomy, astrology, you name it, all of the 7 subjects that were known at the time, he encompasses them in the Divine Comedy, which is amazing.
Wonderful. Folks, I mean, all 3 of you, this is just fantastic. Everybody's just loving it. So what we're going to do now is that now is the main part. We are all reading Dante. Now we get to talk to each other about that. And then this is all to kind of jog your memories and to kind of get you excited about discussing it. So I'm going to start the breakout rooms. The rules are let everybody speak for about a couple of minutes so that everybody gets to put their thoughts on the table. Each of the breakout rooms has a moderator, and their name starts with a star. So listen to them. They will make sure that everybody gets to talk and have a good conversation. It'll be for 30 minutes, after which we're going to come back and to share our takeaways, and you can ask your questions there as well. Starting the breakout rooms now. I want people to be able, everybody wants to hear you talk. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to give a chance for people to first give their takeaways, and they will mention the questions, and then I will ask them to ask the questions again. So let's hear everybody's takeaways. I want to see what people's experiences, experiencing Dante, because many of these folks are reading it for the first time or reading it since they read it as a kid. Let's hear all their experiences, and then so folks, first we'll do the takeaways. You can ask a question during that time. I will just note your name and I will ask you to ask the question again at that point. Okay, so takeaways, do it maybe about 2 minutes maximum or so that we can go through takeaways and we'll have time for questions. All right, so go ahead and type ! To share your takeaways in the chat, or you can go ahead and raise your hand. First up is going to be Vanessa. Vanessa, what is it like reading Dante?
Well, I kind of view it as like a mature version of Aesop's fables, with the symbolism in there. And even it was interesting as it's presented, it's kind of like the punishment fits the crime, like the vain were eyeless, speechless, only emerged long enough to say something and then basically say you will soon be forgotten. but I found it interesting. The four poets and sages, they were the closest to the cusp of hell, but they were still within hell because I guess, they didn't have the final thing to push them over the limit. And the one thing I found odd was like the oxymoron about the meadows that were described. They kind of seem like usually they're peaceful or docile, but yet it's like you had to tread lightly. So even that's like, wait a minute, it makes you pause and think and ponder that. Now I have some questions I'll ask when you're done with this.
Sounds good. I'll put you down for questions. Next up is going to be David S., Joe, Zachary, Marisa, and Judith. David S., what has it been like?
Right. I'm really glad to join your group doing this. It's nice to be carried, by the group with all the points of view that come up. I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone's saying. I'm reading this the second time in my life, which is not much. And looking at it, I suppose, at the most obvious superficial level, which is as a trip, as was pointed out in the first person. So a spiritual trip of the individual. And Dante's trip is from his level of wisdom. He's a comprehensivist. He knows all the sciences, all the realms of philosophy, and he's revealing to us with his wisdom and from the pinnacle of the ability to express things in his language and through metaphor and visions and experience of other people in politics, at that level of understanding, to let us understand this spiritual goal of seeking the light, the highest light in life. And what it is that we're traveling with him is to find that path. And he has to see the structure of good and bad, the whole ethical structure of the universe as an individual, but universally, the way it applies to everything. So you see every different kind of sin, every different kind of politic in history, people who lacked Jesus as being available, so their souls, even though they were pure, had some limitation in his, understanding. So the journey is something we can all share, that quest, because we're all trying to find the best somehow in the life. And he's explaining from his point of view, which I don't, social, ethical, political, that was very helpful to hear that, to carry all those with us. So this moral system, to me, is making sense because he's put it in order. He's given it a structure. It's not a chaotic thing. He has a sense, and that guides me through it with him. And he's the only living one. So I think that gives him, we talked about, that gives him the power to not be at risk at being stuck at each stage. And what that means to me metaphysically in the story is his soul, he's alive. He still has choices in the real physical world. He'll come out of this and he'll have to decide where he ends up in this vast system. So he's the one with physicality, presence. He'll come out and he'll have to decide where his resolution is. And the reason that the one thing I remembered was that these punishments fitting crime is very much back to Platonic and Socratean wisdom, which is someone who does something wrong wants to make up for it in the right way and to heal, so there's a sense of always a balance for spiritual activities. So that really comes from ancient wisdom. And here we're seeing it applied in a system. But when you die and you haven't balanced, then you're stuck somewhere here to balance it out. And it just makes a lot of sense. And that's a level I'm getting in at this point.
Wow. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you so much. Great observations. Next up is Joe, Zach, Marisa, Judith, and Madeline. Joe, what are you getting from it?
So, I mean, it's tough. I mean, I see it too as a journey, right? And I think it's really important. What I'm finding is that it really does show you have to go to hell in order to understand heaven. And that's what the overarching theme for me is that in order, and he does it so beautifully, and even thinking about things that I would have never thought of. So for the example, people that did neither good nor evil. And what is really evil about that? Why are they in hell? Or why is, Seneca in hell? Why are, so, and people
He's in limbo.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's right. He's in limbo. But
limbo, according to Dante, is this place of sorrow. The only thing they feel is the knowledge that God exists, but they could never see him. But other than that, they live in relative comfort. So
So okay, but even as these are like reasons as to why they are where they are, but it kind of gives you, as David would say, that comprehensive view of logic that was being applied by the church, and that to me is fascinating, because it's also, as you know, Deepti had so beautifully pointed out, it's the idea of how to stay on the straight and narrow. That's kind of what this entire poem's about. Not to be distracted by all the things that are wants and our desires. And they're by far the most important takeaway. I mean, there's several I have here, but the most important takeaway that I have at this point was the idea of the rational and the spiritual link that I believe Philip had talked about. With, you know, it's not enough to live a life intellectually. Like, it's the idea of it's your spirit as well, so that it's your actions, and so that it's a story for understanding, like, essentially for ethical behavior. And I guess the three categories that also Philip laid out with the social, political, and the ethical life were very helpful for me as well. But also the reason why it was written in a poem format, in order to kind of bring the artistic and the philosophy together, is also very important for me. But I mean, I'm really enjoying it. I'm enjoying it on a number of levels. You're muted.
So
me?
that was great.
Mm.
I love the way you started, you know, that you have to go through hell in order to get to heaven. And the point that David started with, that he's a comprehensivist. So he brings together everything that he knows into this and makes it work. It's just incredible. And the idea of it being a spiritual trip. Zach, welcome back. Nice to have you back. What are you getting from the reading?
I'm really enjoying it. I mean, all the symbolism is really great. All the kind of philosophical themes as well. I resonated with a lot of what D.W. Jacobs was saying. I automatically thought of A Christmas Carol, like, right away. I'm very familiar with that story, and this is my first time reading Dante, and I just kept thinking of Ebenezer Scrooge. I mean, you know, the ghosts of Christmas past and present and, you know, yet to come are basically showing him, like, you're headed down this wrong road, buddy. Like, this is what's going to happen to you if you continue. So yeah, I've kind of been seeing it through that lens. And then the other thing that D.W. Jacobs said that I was also thinking was this idea of, like, memory and memory palaces. It's another thing I've been getting into lately, and, like, learning about kind of these ancient systems of how we used to memorize information. And, you know, like, Dante's levels of hell, I mean, it's basically just like a textbook memory palace. So yeah, I think that's really cool. And just, like, you know, I'm having read this for the first time, I don't know this, but I wouldn't be surprised if, like, years from now, I could just, you know, tell you the levels of hell, just because it's such, like, a visual image in a specific place. So I think that's just a really awesome, like, literary device.
Wonderful, folks. Folks, also keep track of your questions. Keep note of all your questions that you have. And we're going to get to questions after the takeaways. Thanks, Zach. Next up is Maritza.
Shrikant, this book it creates some emotional dissonance for me. I have to fight it to get to the intellectual part of digestion for this tale. My first thought, to be quite frank, is like, geez, Dante's God is a right bastard. This is my first time reading this, and you know, I know that's slightly more superficial than some of the really deep, fantastic comments you're getting here, but that's it. It really does create in me this like emotional feeling of repulsion. It just really does repulse me that when I consider the possibility that the imagery being painted existed in some form or manner, because, you know, the artist painting this story for us is painting from several aspects that actually existed during his time and his day. And that it's really, really repellent to me. The concept that anyone would have such a belief in the breakout room in which I was, one of our members used the word dogma. And I find that to be the perfect word that kind of pours, you know, cold water on my my emotional dissonance, and helps me consider it more intellectually, because that's exactly what it is. He's painting almost a cautionary tale of something at its extreme. And once you realize that and you set it to the side, you can go through the mental exercise of considering that this is a potential hell inside your mind, and not the vivid, you know, a painting of some omnipotent being who's gonna send you here right? So if you can separate from that, then I can see, and I do see the paces of, you know, our own self-indulgent, our own self missteps leading us down this path here. And these are the things that we struggle with, that we're gonna go through. And I can see that, and I'm looking forward to seeing more. I will say the Canto 11 was kind of my favorite one thus far, because there was a lot more explained in that one. So, you know, that kind of engaged the intellectual side a little more for me. But yeah, that's kind of where I stand right now. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Marisa. It's always challenging reading something from that far back, because the challenge is to actually put yourself in that context and then look at the universal issues, because he's talking about universal issues, but universal issues he's setting in the context that he's familiar with. So you have to understand his context, then universalize it, and then apply it to you. If you can do it and it is hard to do when something is that you're not familiar with. Yes. Thank you. Next up is Judith. Madeline, if anybody else wants to share, you can go ahead and raise your hand in Zoom or type exclamation mark. Judith.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying this. Very excited about it. I've never read it before. I wish I started following CJ's timeline a little sooner, but I've got like 3 books by 3 translations, an audio one, writing notes, listening to the lectures. It's just so interesting to me on many levels. But what Maritza was saying, I mean, I have a lot of the same gut responses as I'm reading, but I'm really suspending it because, judgment. I'm curious later on how I will agree or disagree with the social, ethical, political ideas and our responsibilities and how he presents that. I'm kind of eager to see how he displays all that for us, but just the historical context, the fact that he's writing in Italian, the fact that he's merging so much pagan thought with the Christian thought, the literary techniques, like writing a novel with this drama and story arc and the use of dialogue, and it's the whole thing, and so it's so early for me in this that, when I feel like, when you're reading a novel and things are happening and you're like, no, this doesn't make sense, but you have to like suspend because maybe later on there'll be some clarity. So, but I like that he's triggering thoughts like, why should these people be in limbo? And, like, I'm very curious to find out, how much of all of this is Dante own belief system as a product of that time, and how much of it is his critique, and he's using this as an illustration. So I'm really curious about that, but I really like this. I've cleared my schedule for this.
Wonderful, wonderful. I want to say, I think we are very fortunate to have Doug, Rosella, and Phil with us. Doug has, and the variation in them too. Like Doug has this artistic sensibility where he's able to kind of see at an artistic level what Dante is doing in so many different angles. Rosella, of course, has been marinated in Dante.
Marinated, I like that.
For so long that no matter what she says, all of lots of the flavor of Dante comes out in everything that she's saying. And Phil is a scholar, and he's kind of systematically kind of giving us the context of Dante and around Dante. So it's just a beautiful, I think we are fortunate to have these three folks, helping us through this. So next up is Madeline.
Yes, I was in Rosella's breakout room, and I really appreciated everything I learned about the religion, as well as the history and the nuances. But I most related to what Doug talked about, because it struck me very much, and the things that I marked up in the text all had to do with Dante's sensory impressions, and that it was all about the physicality, that Dante goes there as an embodied mind. And everyone who was suffering in the Inferno, except for those sort of saintly pagans who are in limbo, everyone who is suffering in the Inferno is suffering physically. And his details about the senses were they were so exquisite. I kept making notes next to them and everything, and the richness of his descriptions. And what I kept thinking of, like, he feels the winds, he hears the sounds, there's a horrible swamp, there are the foul odors. And I kept thinking of that poem that was read in Washington, D.C. At the Biden inauguration. And I had tried reading the whole thing online, and I just ended up kind of spacing out and not finishing it because it was full of very vague idealistic terms. I'm not saying I disagree with the vague idealistic terms. And I kept thinking of that poem when I read that one by William Carlos Williams. This is just to say, where he says, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and how exquisitely he captures so much in so few lines with just such a physical narration. And I feel like that is really the strength of what Dante is doing as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. All right. If anybody wants to share what they're getting from reading Dante, this is the time to do it. Otherwise, we're going to go to questions next. I'm going to give about 10 seconds if somebody wants to share. Let me see. I think Shirley has difficulty pressing. Shirley, did you want to share anything? You need to press unmute.
Well, I love it, but one of the things I found, I guess it was in Canto I, about Francesco and her lover, Paolo. Well, we know the poem that Paolo, thank you. We know the poem that what she said, but Dante does not give us what Paolo thought or said. And I happened to find that in Keats. It's a couple lines if you want me to read it.
Please.
Because we have no idea what Cato or what Paolo felt like. But to that second circle of sad hell, where amid the gusts, the whirlwind and the flow of rain and hailstones, lovers need not tell their sorrows. Pale were the sweet lips I saw, pale were the lips I'd kiss, and fair the form I floated with about that melancholy storm.
Thank you. Thank
you. So we know what he felt now.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, folks. So now it's time for questions. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you have any questions. Zach.
Yeah, so I had a question. So, so during Dante's time, he and kind of everybody else believed in an afterlife and believed that hell, was a real thing, believed heaven was a real thing. So I understand there's like a very kind of like literal angle to all of this, but I also wonder how much of this is meant to be seen as kind of like maybe a metaphor for like hell on earth or heaven on earth, and maybe like, kind of be warned if you're a glutton because, your sins will have this effect in this life. Or if like how much of reading Dante is seen through that lens, or do most people just say, no, this is like something we should be looking at as like, this is what happens to you after you die if you're a glutton?
No, can I answer?
Please, yeah.
Yeah. One of the mistakes that readers make is to think that Dante had some kind of foresight about the afterlife or whatnot. You have to understand that this was an allegorical poem, an allegorical epic. Everything as a symbol for something else. So he mentions certain, like in the gluttonous, he mentions a Florentine person that Dante actually knew, Chaco, right? And the vision of him was that he didn't recognize him because of how skinny now he was and all, in hell and everything. Everything is a symbolism for ice cream is good. If you eat ice cream all day long by the pound, you'll get sick or really very fat. You understand what I'm saying it in like really simple terms. He is not a bishop. He's not an archbishop or he is not an authority of the church. He has a lot of anger. When he's writing the Inferno, he sticks 5 popes in hell. He does it for his own cleansing, his own, but he was very, Dante the person, the poet, was a very, he really firmly believed that society would be a much better place if everybody had a place in it. Social, ethical, religious, political, a role. You have to have some kind of a role or you're just wasting your time and others. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, go ahead, Zach, if you want to.
Yeah. So to follow up on that, so I understand that, these weren't like he literally thought that these were what was going to happen to people in the afterlife. But I guess my question is he saying these things are kind of metaphorically what is going to happen to people in the afterlife, or these are kind of metaphorically things that are going to happen to people in this life?
Can I jump in to answer that?
Go
Shrita?
ahead.
Yeah, so I don't know if you remember when I was talking about the 4 different meanings that you can read this with. And so Dante himself is telling us that, look, there is the physical reality that I'm describing here. And we can think of it as the dream he had or whatever it was that he actually experienced or he claims he experienced. But then the next level of reading is the metaphorical or allegorical description of it. And the allegorical part takes us out of the hell per se, the physical hell, right? The literal hell that we get to after death. And that allegorical meaning is what you are, I think, implying in your question is, do we actually get to experience this on this earth? And the answer, I think, is yes.
Yes.
That was his point, because otherwise, if he's just writing to give us some description of hell, well, what's the point of that? I mean, I guess he could scare us, but I think it's deeper than that. It's not just about scaring us. It's about saying, look, things that we do have consequences even here and now. And I think that's the crux of your question, if I understood it correctly. And I think that's actually very intuitive, because he probably saw the reality of violence and fraud and avarice in Florence and in his life. And so he describes it in allegorical terms as a like literal hell. But in reality, what's more important than that is the fact that when we, and I think Roselle was using ice cream as an example, that if we do things here and now that are wrong, the improper, non-Aristotelian golden middle way, then we're going to experience hell here and now. And the allegories of these punishments that he gives us, and I think this goes back to Maritz's repellent sort of feeling on this. It should repel us because that's the effects that we're going to get. I think that's what he's trying to tell us. The effects that we're going to get if we do this the wrong way are going to be repellent to us primarily in here and now, not just in the afterlife.
Excellent, Phil. That was great. So Phil, Doug, and Rosella, do you just jump in whenever you want to ask a question? Even if somebody else has answered the question, you can go ahead and give your own answer. Next up is going to be David, Vanessa, and Joe. David.
I'll just make a brief comment right now. I did post the text of This Is Just to Say, which I think is a fabulous little poem. And I performed it so many times I've memorized it, but it's, I just wanted to add, he's so efficient because he was a doctor and he apparently wrote his poetry on prescription pads between patients. So no matter how little time you have, you can be a poet.
All right, I just want to plug something which is very apropos given Doug's comment. This Wednesday, we are going to be talking about art and medicine, the use of art in medicine. So that's and the gentleman who is doing that is actually the head of the Physicians Poetry Association. So that's exactly, it's the kind of thing that he would do. Next up is going to be, I lost it here, David.
Right, something I was asking in our group, and it's great to follow after the poem you just posted, which is so terse, brief, and focused. It's like an arrow, right to a point. But this, compare that to this epic, right? Here we have, in our times, I said the function of poetry, in my ignorance knowledge with poetry, it's about describing intensely and clearly an experience or a moment in life or something significant in a life or a beautiful image, right? This commedia is a whole other realm. It's about the world, the universe, about a traveling poem, like we said, epic. So what is poetry being used this way in our lives? I mean, I heard the speech at the inaugural and it carried me to that moment as a historical moment, but it's by no means epic, right? It grasps the moment in history. What do we have literarily now going on? Anything that is trying to approach human life as a vision? And I kind of humorously said, well, are we stuck with the Marvel universe as the only thing that's looking at it artistically, the whole universe, right?
Well, I will answer that a little bit. I think the poets that most approached this critique of politics and spirit and were highly varied in their own political positions were the beat poets, right in the middle of the 20th century. And they were called beat, not because of music, because they were beat at the end of World War II and the economic disasters that sort of hit the country at the end of World War II and the sort of disappointed hope that they expected at that point in time. It's also the point in time where Miller wrote Death of a Salesman, Tennessee Williams wrote about mendacity, and they kind of almost predicted by 50 years the fall of the American Empire. And so the beat poets were very close to that. I think some of the spoken word poets are very complex in the way they deal with sort of the inner and outer life. And some maybe not so much, but I think there are a lot of people doing this, but it's a pretty vast world, but poetry is not valued in the US. And so we don't see it. It's there, but you have to go on a search for it. You have to go on your own journey to find the poets you might like. For example, many people think in Germany, I've been told, he's known here as a great playwright, right? But in Germany, apparently they consider him a better poet than they do a playwright. And so I think I may have talked about that before. In other countries, whether it's Mexico or Latin America, there is not a division between theater and movies and poetry. They kind of live in a very much a connected world. Here, we like to categorize and divide. They do movie plays, they do screenplays, they do stage plays. They are stage actors, they're movie actors, they're designers. But you know, in other countries, there's a much more rich blending of all of the arts. And so it's sort of there, but you have to search for it. I'll try to think of a few. I mean, for example, the Black poet, I mentioned this in the breakout, Mary Baraka, and maybe I mentioned in my speech, you know, one of the most aggressive Black poets of the 20th century was very into Dante and very into the poetic tradition. And he actually did write a play called The Life and Life of Bumpy Johnson, which is the gangster who protects it. And there's actually a religious figure in that play. It's a sort of Sufi figure, which the director thought was a joke. But Mary Baraka means spirit. It was no joke when he wrote that play. That character was an essential part of the transformation of Harlem. The religious figure and the philosophical figures and the artists and the gangsters who protected it, you know, Mary Baraka is a good place to start. And then poets who were influenced by him. It's a very potent political critique. But as I say, the beat poets, some of them are very conservative, some of them are very progressive and radical, but they were trying to tackle this.
Wonderful. Next up is Vanessa, Joe, and I don't know who is next. So Vanessa and Joe. Vanessa.
Well, I got a couple of questions, but also one I'm interested in most, and unfortunately may take the longest to answer. In the Inferno, is night and stars emphasized and symbolic at the beginning? Because in Genesis, light was created on the first day. And I think a cantos or two later, it speaks about like 6 different time periods. It's kind of implied like 6 separate periods of time, whether they're days or just simply different things of effort. And then it says, and then they took their leave. Well, on the 7th day, God rested, you know, took, 6 days to make the heavens and the earth. Or am I just reading too much into that?
Which cantos are you referring to?
Well, just how in the very beginning, I think in the first cantos, like the light and the stars is emphasized, it kind of sticks out. And I'm thinking just, and like in the beginning, God created light. That's how, in Genesis.
Right. And so anything that is on top of the hill, the stars and the sun that's coming coming out, rising in the morning, is a reference to God. And that's why as he go the other way with Virgil, there will be no light until he comes out on the morning of Easter Sunday, and the line is and to re-behold the stars, and they were able to see the stars. And then it's not by they came out on the morning of Easter Sunday because it's when God resurrected. So they came out of the Inferno on the morning of Easter Sunday.
Thank you, Rosella. Next up is going to be Joe. Folks, if you have questions, you can go ahead and type ! Joe.
I just need clarification for my notes that you mentioned that Dante is always, or Virgil's always in front of Dante. And that was very significant. Could you repeat as to why?
Because he represents human reason in the Inferno, and therefore he is the teacher, the guide, the mentor, and Dante would not be as reverent towards him if he would pass him. It would be his pride would dictate him passing him. And it's exactly his pride that Dante wants to curb.
So it's almost like a religious ceremony in some degree.
No,
or-
I don't think
well,
it has anything to do with religion. It has to do with reverence. With he's a teacher, he's his guide, and so he pays homage to him. He respects him.
Okay.
It has nothing to do with religion. No.
Okay, Vanessa, you had one more question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, one thing that came to mind as I was reading it, does the leftward movement emphasize relate to the statement in the Nicene Creed that Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father?
Okay.
That came to mind.
I didn't understand the question.
Okay, it's kind of a little bit obscure. So let's do one thing. I want to give a chance for the panelists to ask each other questions, because it's all three of you are coming from very different approaches. You're all of you have got are putting a lot into it. So if you, Rosella, it is so I'm so grateful that you are here.
Oh, thank you.
Because what happens is that you have actually lived it. See, what happens is that these works are incredibly deep,
Yes.
deep. And it's like you have to go through them again and again and again and again. And at every stage you kind of learn more. Now, Phil and Doug, fantastic as they are, they have not read this 300 times. Okay.
No.
So
Yeah, but they're fantastic too, though.
no, I love them. Okay, they're fantastic, and they're approaching it from all kinds of different angles. But I want
If you want us to all answer a question, you might repeat it, because I get absorbed with an answer Rosella's giving or Phil's giving, and I actually forget what the question was. So,
Me too. I kind of do that too.
So
unfortunately,
you need to,
I have to click off in a couple of minutes.
Sure. Okay. All right. So let's.
I had one comment on something Maritza brought up. I too have sometimes a gut aversion.
Let me do one thing. Let me first let's close up some things so that Rosella can live, and then we will continue with this. We will continue with the comment. So Rosella, this is fantastic.
Thank you.
Working very well. So look forward to next time.
Thank you.
And I will send you emails, and we'll see you at 4:45 for the next one. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. So Doug, go on. Sorry about the interruption.
Oh, just the sort of gut aversion to some of it. Or I love the phrase. I wrote it down. Dante's God is a right bastard. I think that's just a great phrase. Whether you agree with it or not, it does catch a certain aversion I sometimes have, and then I'm captivated by something else or pulled into it. I remember in my 20s, as I was sort of moving away from my church upbringing and trying to figure it out. I had moved away when I was 19. I really liked a lot of C.S. Lewis, and then he would take a leap of faith about 2/3 of the way through the book. I just couldn't follow him, and it would just really make me angry. It was like, okay, I'm following you. It's great. It's beautiful. You're a good writer. You're well-read. And then boom, he'd leap to some point, and I'd go, yeah, no, you missed me. I lost the thread there. And so that, I think all of this sort of apologetics stuff, which there's an element of that, but I realize it's much beyond that. He actually goes to the heart of all the traditions, which is that the sexual and even the murderous sins are not as bad as the economic sins. That goes back to the earliest scriptures. I even studied with a rabbi, because she was around the corner teaching 20th century philosophies. And she said Sodom and Gomorrah was not destroyed for its sexual sins. It was destroyed because it's I am not my brother's keeper attitude. That's why God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. They were economic sins. And so I think Dante gets to the heart of that tradition. And so the financial sins are in the deepest part of hell. The fraud, You know, it's not the murderers or the sexual sins that deserve the worst punishment. It's the financial fraud.
Wonderful.
So in some ways, you have to look at what's the spine of what he's getting at rather than the exoteric. And there were traditions in Spain where the exoteric churches were separate. The Jews, the Christians, the Islam, they were all separate practices. But among the mystics, they were kind of one practice. And the secret teachings, they shared things. They shared music, they shared philosophy, they shared poetry, they shared symbolism, and they were all very much on the same page. So much so that when we did a Jewish arts festival and some Jewish musicians couldn't show up because of some visa program, we brought in some Arab musicians who knew the music and could play with this Jewish group. That's how profound the interlacing of music and poetry was in the golden age of Spain before Spain decided to purify itself and throw out all the polluted people.
Wow. So I want to give, firstly, Doug, I want to ask you, what is it like reading Dante?
Doug, what's it like reading Dante?
Yes. Yes.
Well, I sort of was thinking about this. I was thinking about Mortimer Adler's thing, which I don't like a lot of things about Mortimer Adler's sort of superior attitude, but he does recommend that you read something 3 times, which I do when I train actors. I make them take a very complex poem and just read it out loud 3 times. And suddenly the tongue finds more meaning by exploring it sensually than the mind will wrestling with the meaning for 3 weeks. You know, if you speak it out loud, suddenly the actor knows what the poem means if you read it 3 times. And wants to sort of make sense of it, wants to maybe over enunciate the sounds. Like when I speak very aggressively some poetry, my parakeet starts going crazy, you know, and he catches the rhythm of it somehow. And then you read it to make sense of it the 3rd time. You don't even bother. You give it a handshake the 1st time. You over enunciate the sounds the 2nd time. Then you read it naturally the 3rd time. And so sometimes I find I'll read it in one translation, then I'll read it again, or maybe I'll read it in a separate translation. And then maybe I'll listen to a recording. And at some point, the sweep of it sort of overwhelms me. I'm no longer caught in the footnotes, and then the sweep of it kind of like, it's like, whoa, that was, and I see things I just never saw in previous readings. I just like, you know, and I don't know whether that's the density of Dante or I'm getting old, but one or the other. It's like I lose track of stuff. So
wonderful.
That's my experience. He's a test of my memory and brain power.
Wonderful. Phil, what about you? What has it been like?
Well, you know, it's a different experience than the last time we were doing this. One is, you know, last time I was really focused on individual verses and details. And now that I am thinking, okay, what are the main points? What are the salient features of the entire thing? And that type of reading forces you to look at, I mean, you still have to understand, you know, obviously and follow along the details, which are extremely interesting in themselves. But then it forces you to ask the big questions. What's the theme? What are the grand themes? What are the unifying themes? And that actually are some of the questions I ask in life in general. So it's very helpful to have Dante kind of lead you along. One of the things that came out in our breakout room was this relationship between culture and religion, because of course Dante brings in the classical tradition with the Christian religion and interweaves the two. And I think it's a question that we just can't get away from in our society, whether, even though we're, you know, the Western world is in a post-Christian era, the story is not over. And of course, you know, if let's say the Islamic world takes ascendance, they will be asking those same questions about the interplay of culture and religion. They're already asking them because it's inevitable, because you have this sort of religious dogmatic view, and then you need to somehow integrate it with where people actually live, which is emotional and artistic and non-rational, like we talked about. So anyways, so my reading is much more focused on, again, the big themes and how the whole thing is put together versus, so it's more synthetic versus analytical, I guess. I'm trying to synthesize these big things. And it's been great because as I prepare and I'm thinking, what am I going to share? These things kind of emerge. And
wonderful. Do you remember what are we doing next time? And the date?
Oh, and the reading?
Yep.
I think it's 11. So it's 12 through 22, I think.
Okay. And do you remember the date?
Well, it's April 4th.
April
I believe it's
April
April
4th.
April 4th?
Yes.
Okay, April 4th. Folks, see you back on April 4th.
Easter Sunday, isn't it?
Oh, it's Easter Sunday? Oh, okay, but it's later in the day. So we said it was okay.
Nobody will miss
calculated-
church.
CJ, yeah, CJ did a fantastic job of kind of doing the entire scheduling. So we debated all dates and we decided that it was okay. So, all right, folks. So see you then.